This is the Bruchim podcast, the only podcast in the world dedicated to Jews who think differently about circumcision. Previously on the Bruchim podcast.
If I can tell you right now, God spoke to me last night. Turned out while you guys were talking and diddling about this, and then God actually spoke. I just got a revelation. It's crazy.
Again?
Yeah, the boss call came down and says, "You guys, I was wrong." Turns out, you guys have been getting this wrong the whole time. And don't even get me started on separate milk and meat dishes, but you guys have been getting this wrong big time. Turns out, by circumcision, I just meant like squeezing it. I didn't mean cutting it. If you heard that, okay, wouldn't any of us who heard that want to say, okay, then forget it. We're not going to just because we've done it in the past, we're going to just continue to cut this portion. Why? The baby cries. It's 1 second of crying. Even 1 second of crying is better than 0 seconds of crying.
I know, but what I'm trying to nail you down, Jeff,
Even
what I'm trying to nail you down on here is you seem to have a very kind of
less is more. Okay?
Ambivalent. You seem to be stating that you don't really see this as any kind of ethical violation worthy of massive concern. But when I proposed something that is similar to you on the female side, you're saying, no, obviously, we don't want to be doing that. And what I'm trying to get you to explain is why.
That's not what I said. I said less is more. I said I just gave an example of even the male case where I would go with less. Look, less cutting is better than more. Less blood is better than more. Less cry. Imagine if I've never heard a baby cry in a simchat bat. Well, that's not true. But they don't cry from the simchat bat procedure. But I've heard a baby cry for circumcision. Let's say a baby cries for exactly 2 seconds of entirely negligible suffering, but it's 2 seconds of suffering for a male circumcision and 0 for the female because there's no cutting at all. I'd say, or let's say the baby has to wait for 5 minutes before its diaper gets changed under a male circumcision, but has to wait only for 2 minutes under a female. I'd go with the less. All else equal, and really if all else was equal, less harm, even of a very momentary, negligible kind that doesn't raise ethical problems, I'd favor the less.
Welcome back to the Bruchim podcast. I'm your host, Eli Sargon, and joining me today from New Haven, Connecticut is Bruchim's Director of Education and my co-host, Max Duboff. Max, it's great to be recording with you again.
Yes, I totally agree, Ellie, and there's nothing I love more than talking with our guest today about philosophy.
And speaking of our guest, joining us from Hong Kong is our returning champion, Bruchim's Director of Strategic Initiatives, Max Buckler. Max, it's great to have you back on the podcast after so long.
Returning champion, huh? That's a big mantle to bear. Let's get into it.
Look, we've got 2 Maxes and an Ellie. I think it's fair to call this the Bruchim Pro Max podcast. Anyhow, today we're going to be discussing Max Buckler's incredible paper, The Smallest Cut, the Ethics and Surprising Implications of Hatafat brit for the Ongoing Genital Cutting Debate. And before we dive in, Max Buckler, could you tell us a little bit of the backstory here? How is it that you came to write this paper? What brought you to this specific topic and this angle on the subject?
Well, this is tied in a little bit to one of the concepts that I've written about in other places about the distinction between bodily states and experience acts, which was something I was already working on and had written about before. And sort of through that analysis, I came to realize more and more the significance of hatafat brit, and also that practice occupied a major gap in the scholarship on body modification and religious genital cutting practices. Also tied into probably a lot of what we're going to talk about today is that examining this practice and some of the implications of it, I think is a very natural evolution of where, at least in the bioethics scholarship, these issues have gone of late, particularly when we're talking less and less about how weighty medical benefits might be.
Before we dive into this amazing article, I just want to set the table a little bit for our audience. Max Duboff, why don't you give us just a sort of 101, what is hatafat brit and where does it come from?
Yeah, fantastic. So hatafat brit is a Hebrew word meaning drawing of the blood of the covenant, right? And so hatafat brit is a procedure that is performed in place of circumcision when you would do circumcision, but circumcision can't happen. So what hatafat brit is, it's pricking the penis to draw a small amount of blood.
Thank you. And there are basically two kinds of situations that we sort of encounter hatafat brit in the real world, and that is either in an intersex situation or a situation where the child is born without a foreskin and the parents want to bring them into the covenant of Abraham according to religious law. So they'll draw a drop of blood from the penis and do a hatafat brit in that situation. And the other very common situation where we find hatafat brit, where we encounter it today, is with conversions where the prospective convert is already circumcised. And when they convert, as part of their conversion, there'll be a hatafat brit. Max Buckler, one more facet about hatafat brit that I think is really interesting that you bring up in your paper that I want to sort of lay out on the table here at the top is that it's also a kind of attempt by the rabbis to negotiate a conflict, really, which is that there is a religious rabbinic injunction against making modifications to the body. So in the design of this rite, where you're just drawing a drop of blood, it's not an accident that it's a minimal procedure, because the rabbis, with the exception of removing the foreskin, which is in the rabbinic imagination in a completely different place, the rabbis were trying to come up with a procedure that was minimally invasive and damaging because they actually do have a religious concept of not damaging the body, right?
And not just minimally invasive, but minimally invasive to the maximum extent. And that, we can learn a lot about thinking through what's essential in these practices by examining those competing values, because we see what ends up being practiced and being valued and kept when certain ideas come into conflict. This actually separates the rabbis and the Jewish tradition from other circumcising traditions. That's another lesson we can learn from it, because, like, for example, Muslims don't have a comparable hatafat brit like ritual for the penis, because what they're talking about is merely just like being in that state of foreskinlessness, versus what we learn with the rabbis. They're saying, no, we need to do something. We need to actually do some type of cut, some type of rite to cross this liminal state and to have our ritual. But to do that, we need to conform with our other values, which include any modification. You can't do a marking, a tattoo on the body. And that's why it actually gets reduced to this single pinprick. It's got to be as small as possible.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And one thing which I'll note, Max, in response to what you were just saying, is that I think even in the Tanakh, even in the Torah and the prophets, there's actually a bit of a negotiation here between what matters with circumcision. Is it kind of doing the act itself? Is it the time of the act? Is it a sort of tribal marker? And Eli and I have an ongoing series of text studies on texts about circumcision in Tanakh, which is going into some of these issues. So I'll just put in a plug for that. But, really, it's not even just a one-sided picture on some of the dimensions you were just raising when we look at Jewish foundational texts.
Yeah. And that's why one of the reasons, like, even if we're just forgetting about the whole ethics conversation, about modern ethics conversation about circumcision or religious genital cutting or anything, we could just learn a ton of Jewish lessons from studying hatafat brit and like why it's being performed and what it means about circumcision and about ritual in general.
Two other things which I'll mention is that one context in which hatafat brit comes up as well, to add to what Eli was saying before, is what's known as a gir l'chumra, a sort of conversion just to be sure. So it's not uncommon that someone who converted with a more liberal Jewish movement will then, if they become involved with a more traditional Jewish movement, undergo another conversion. And the thought is maybe it's not that they're actually not Jewish, or maybe there's something going on in the family, like maybe, for example, their mother had a less strict conversion before they were born or something like that. So they're like definitely Jewish in some sense, affiliated with Jewish community, and so might well have been circumcised as a Jew. at some point in their life, but are now undergoing what is technically a conversion and will undergo hatafat brit for that reason. We'll go into that a bit more elsewhere in this season. And then one more thing I'll note about hatafat brit, and I really mentioned this before, but I want to emphasize it, is that it is all about drawing blood. Circumcision in the rabbinic imagination has a lot to do with blood as well, but most Jews today who are having circumcision performed or undergoing circumcision are really not focusing on the blood aspect. So hatafat brit centers the blood in a way that might well be uncomfortable or possibly interesting and really powerful for folks.
All right, so Max Buckler, let's get into the paper. You recognize, I think brilliantly and very saliently, that the existence of hatafat brit and the practice of hatafat brit actually challenges the dominant narratives in the discourse around circumcision and the various camps that have formed in the discourse around talking about circumcision. Tell us what it is about hatafat brit that kind of upends the way that most people have been thinking about circumcision in the academic literature.
Well, mostly simply put, it's because it's a pinprick, so it doesn't leave us with a body modification to discuss, like whether it's beautifying, damaging, whether that's good or bad, which the main debate over time has been about whether the consequence of the procedure that's being discussed is really significant, and then if you can describe it as damaging. So when we're talking about something that's a single pinprick, we actually can't have that conversation. It's a totally different conversation. So if we're going to say that these are related, we have to start approaching it from a way different lens. That's probably the simplest way to explain it. But I see it through a construction that I describe as the distinction between acts and states. And I think understanding a little bit about what that distinction is helps us look not just at hatafat brit, but at all the procedures under discussion.
So why, though, should we use, or can we use hatafat brit as a test case for circumcision? Right? I mean, these are different kinds of procedures, right? One is a body modification, one is not. So how do we get from talking about hatafat brit to lessons for the circumcision debate?
When we look at the circumcision debate, there's a major tension going back, the question of whether general principles can be applied to the question of circumcision. So is there something like, per se, the right to bodily integrity that prevents all the procedures, whether they're maximally damaging or they're token and symbolic, that we can apply? Or are we looking at unique aspects of a single procedure that make it stand alone? And when we talk about that latter thing, which is, are there unique aspects to various procedures, these could include the level of damage, but they could also include proposed health benefits. With hatafat brit, I'm reducing it to the smallest possible procedure in the category.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really cracks open the entire discourse in a really interesting way and forces us to really contend with what some of our underlying presumptions about why we think these practices may or may not be problematic. I was wondering if you could share with our audience a little bit about your discovery that somewhat perhaps counterintuitively, there are many Jewish parents who feel more strongly that hatafat brit is not something that they'd want to do than they do about the much more extensive and dramatic standard male circumcision.
This part is so fascinating.
Yeah, I quoted an article from Kveller about this, where we saw that position being taken, where we see parents who either have children who have been circumcised if they've been adopted, or they circumcise their children and they have no problem with that. But then when it comes to doing hatafat brit to make it ritually valid in the religious case, then they object. That seems counterintuitive to people who are used to these debates. Where I actually think this was in the Bruchim podcast in season 1 when Jeff Helmroth said, "Can we reduce circumcision to just squeezing it, or just something that's smaller? Smaller would be better." We have this concept when you're talking about circumcision that smaller is better. So what do we make of these parents who have no problem with the larger body modification but have a problem with the token?
So what you're saying is that the intuition of these parents that you've discovered that are much more disturbed by hatafat brit than they are by circumcision itself that intuition may actually be coming from a place that can reveal to us something important about our moral sense of what is actually at the root of the problem. And that could then also be applied to circumcision in a really interesting way, right? So that so maybe if you could articulate for our audience, what is it? What is the moral intuition that these parents are feeling, even if they don't have the language to articulate it? And how can we use that moral intuition to think differently about circumcision?
Well, as one parent put it directly in my, as I quoted in the paper, I couldn't imagine telling my child that a stranger is going to see them naked and prick their penis and draw blood from it for symbolism. And I can't really put it better than that. That's just the parent's moral intuition that this is just a violation of the child's privacy. And, we could talk about how to name that violation, but basically the parent saying this is inappropriate.
And I think this comes back to your distinction between acts and states. So when the normal sort of conversation about circumcision tends to focus on the effects of the circumcision, what you're trying to draw our attention back to through thinking about hatafat brit is the actual act of the hatafat brit may itself be the bedrock moral violation that we're talking about here. Did I get that right?
It could be classified as the foundational bedrock major harm, or it could be thought of as one more potential harm that gets into the entire schema, which when we're trying to make a determination of whether something's permissible or impermissible, you just have to weigh it very strongly. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be the ultimate trump, but I think it's certainly very important to add to your calculation. And what's fundamental about it, to respond to what you're asking, is that it applies to all genital cutting acts. When you're trying to compare across whether circumcisions is actually could be compared to stuff like FGC or intersex procedures, all of those procedures share this feature of being a potential invasion of a personal boundary and attached to these intimate concepts of the body.
You just brought up privacy. In your paper, you also talk about boundaries. In other work, you've talked about bodily integrity. I'm quite interested in respect. I maybe want to get into that. But can you just say a little bit more, Max, about what exactly is wrong with hatafat brit from your perspective? What kind of boundary is it violating? How would you describe why this is not the sort of way that we should be treating people?
The argument I'm raising with hatafat brit is that it should be impermissible to do religious things to children's genitals. And that is whether you're doing something that alters their genitals for life, or just that you're doing something that interacts with their genitals and breaks that boundary, which we normally hold as very sacred. And we tell the children later when they grow up that these are your private parts, and they can later understand that the event, well, those are my private parts, and someone got to do something or felt they had to do something to them, which I am suggesting should not be permissible.
I just want to ask both of you a question and get your response to it, because I'm really curious what you think about this. In ethical conversations about genital cutting practices, we often hear a very convenient line cited, which is it medically necessary, right? And it's sort of a really easy way for people to say, to put all kinds of procedures and interactions with the genitals to one side and say, here's the dividing line. Is it medically necessary? So a couple of things about this. First of all, I'm starting to think that this line is just a convenience thing and doesn't actually have any heft, because it's always necessarily going to have to refer to some other kind of ethical principle for it to have any kind of weight. So that's the first problem that I have with this. And the second issue is, I would really love it if both of you could explain to me in your own words, what is the difference between a diaper change and hatafat brit, ethically speaking?
I wanted to make something very clear about the paper and the argument and the conversation about hatafat brit, because I know from some of the other last season of the Bruchim podcast, this was something that came up about saying, I think Jeff said that if you can't interact with your children's bodies, then that negates the parental role. I'm not suggesting that there aren't times when it's appropriate or even, I would say, morally obligated for you to interact with their body, including private parts. Jeff's totally right. You have to do that every day. But where I fall on this is that the reason you can do a diaper change is because basically it's medically necessary, which is something that reduces to a concept Max raised in the first season of the podcast, which is that we're more saying it's for their sake, not for the parents. But even if we look at a diaper change, and I just want to raise this example because it challenges some of our intuition here. You can't just do anything while you're doing a diaper change. If we saw someone doing a diaper change and then they just started playing with the child's body while they were doing the diaper change, they weren't like all business about like cleaning it up, then we might say like that's an inappropriate diaper change. So we see this question coming up in every kind of way that people interact with someone's body. But medical necessity is something that I'm still counting as a benchmark of like what's permissible in situations where we're conceivably violating someone's boundaries. That's the reason why we have this concept of medical necessity in ethics, is because everything that we're doing when we do medical interventions is potentially, a violation under a certain scheme, and we have to place this there so that we can get something we need, which is medical intervention.
Yeah, no, but Eli, I really appreciate this question because I take it that part of what you're wondering about and beginning to challenge is the coherence of medical necessity. So one thing that you might do to sort of ground medical necessity is to say, well, it's really about some kinds of harm. And then we're going to need to say more about what harm is. So maybe if someone will suffer some kind of physical or psychological or other harm, then medical necessity is a shorthand for trying to prevent that harm, right? So really the question is, if I don't do an act, will this person suffer in some way? And if the answer is yes, then it seems like this act is medically necessary. And if the answer is no, then it seems like it's not medically necessary. But the problem is, people would say, if you don't make sure that someone is Jewish and included in Jewish community, isn't that a form of suffering?
You're just back at square one. Because if the whole thing just reduces back to, is the person going to have, is it like a cost benefit analysis, basically? Then medical necessity is just kind of a red herring. It's just like a term that we throw out there to imply that we can actually know that there's this entire category of things that will always weigh better in the benefit over the cost. And so but I actually think it's just kind of a dodge, to be honest with you, because I think you actually need to look at every single instance. And I think Max Buckler was getting at this with a diaper change, because even a diaper change isn't necessarily just a diaper change. You have to
even a medical and something. If we all agree something's medically necessary, then there's still the procedure that we do is still going to have to be scrutinized ethically.
I guess what I'm getting at here, and I just want to I want to sharpen this point because I think it's really important, is that I don't think medical necessity is a useful concept, because I think ultimately what it's there to do is it's there to salve an intuition that there should be some kinds of interventions that are allowed, permissible, and protected.
Yeah, that's precisely why it is a useful concept.
No, but it's not useful because it doesn't give us any lines.
Medical necessity is appealing to something maybe about harms or something, which I think are quite important. But the thought here seems to be, for me at least, that there's something kind of more fundamental about our interactions with others. And I think this is what Max is getting at in the paper. And medical necessity might have a lot of benefits for thinking about how to craft medical systems that respect rights and things like that. So medical necessity might have a lot of use in sort of practical bioethics. But I think if we're trying to think about something like, is hatafat brit permissible? I'm actually inclined to agree with you, Eli, that medical necessity is not a super helpful concept.
No, I also think it's not a super helpful concept for diaper changes, strictly speaking. I mean, I just find the whole concept to be...
I was just saying with diaper changes that it's more in that... a diaper change is more in the territory of something that's medically necessary than hatafat brit is. Because like if you don't change it, then you would get sick, like, and potentially get very ill. Like it's not even that we're changing their diapers merely because like we don't want it to smell bad. Like there's a lot more to it than that, and like it's attached to something we would describe as medical. And another thing interesting about diaper changes is that like for the context of this conversation is that it's not something that's seen as like desirable for anyone. Like you rarely hear people being like, oh, like this places it more in the category of saying like this is care work that you do for for the child's own sake, which like helps get it in the territory that I think Max appreciates, which is saying like if we're thinking about like what's dignified in terms of how we treat other people, that's something that gets us much closer when we're doing it for as much purely for them as we can.
Right, exactly. And so we have various duties of care to other people, and that's to help them in some ways, to prevent them from suffering or undergoing harm in some ways. And so in addition to our duties of care, we might have all kinds of other reasons to care for others, right? Again, to either benefit them or prevent them from suffering, something like that. And so diaper changes really seem to fall into that sort of benchmark, although a lot of these duties of care can in some ways be traced to some of these kinds of respect or human dignity points or something along those lines. But this is a big problem with, sort of trying to understand the principles behind bioethics in detail. I think for Max's argument, though, it's really helpful the more detail we can have, though, on some of these fundamental principles.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to sort of push back on that a little bit and say, tell me then why a person couldn't make a good argument for hatafat brit being part of a religious duty of care.
Well, so unfortunately, I think they can. Right.
Yeah, I also agree they can. That's the question.
So then combating that sort of argument or disagreeing with that sort of argument would then really have to engage with why that sort of religious duty of care is not as important as some kind of other duty of care or not valid or something like that. And this is a big problem, I think. But Max, how do you arrive at the conclusion that hatafat brit is at least presumed impermissible?
Yeah, I mean, hatafat brit, a practice which has kind of flown under the radar, shares the characteristics with practices that are widely thought of as morally wrong, even if they're not body modifications. So if you had a situation where like a child was being taken into a room, let's just say like a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old was being taken into a room and then a strange person took off their pants and like touched their butt. Let's just say, if I just said to someone on the street, oh, do you think that's something that sounds wrong or does that sound fine? I don't think you'd find anyone who said it sounds fine. People would say it sounds wrong. Now, hatafat brit shares those exact characteristics. They're just like being taken to a place where they're being exposed to an adult and having their private anatomy interacted with and then being sent on their way. I'm suggesting that I'm beginning the conversation that type of interaction isn't appropriate in a religious context. Of course, the antidote to that for people who want to preserve it as a religious practice are going to say that the particulars of and the specifics of like why their religious ideas are important are enough to outweigh and defeat that general example I gave, which sounds more frivolous. But what I'm at least trying to establish in the paper is that this practice of hatafat brit is very similar to that other thing, which people think of as, quite bad, despite not modifying the body.
Yeah, Max, and I appreciate that in your paper you raise some cases as well about if someone is unconscious, then you still absolutely cannot touch their genitalia or something like that, even if it won't cause any body modification and they won't remember it, that it's still impermissible to touch their genitalia. And this covers cases of possible sexual assault as well when someone is unconscious, actual cases where for medical training purposes, pelvic exams have been performed on unconscious patients. These are, really, really problematic cases. And I take it that you're saying that hatafat brit is relevantly similar to some of these kinds of cases where there is this kind of boundary crossing in terms of impermissibly, illicitly touching genitalia. Is that right?
Yes, and I mean that's relevant to conversations about infants and small children. Sometimes it helps to think about like an unconscious adult. It shows that even if the person's not consciously experiencing this trespass, a potential trespass to their intimate anatomy, we could still see it as wrong to do, even if they're never going to remember it. That's why that particular aspect is in the paper, and also because I was directly responding to Moyles who've precisely made that argument, who thought that hatafat brit was okay for small children who wouldn't remember it, but not for adolescents who might experience it as a violation, in their conscious, remembered way.
Yeah, good. So I really want to get into this question about how the permissibility of hatafat brit changes when you have folks of different ages, right? So I think one issue that started to come up in what we were just discussing is that a lot of folks assume or treat infants as if they don't have that much agency or rights. They don't, have the presumption that their genitalia or intimate body parts shouldn't be interfered with. And I think what all of us here would want to affirm, just to start out this part of the conversation, right, is that even for folks who are very young or can't object, that, a lot of these general principles still apply, right? That it is still problematic in some way, impermissible to, without some kind of justifying reason, touch or use for ritual purposes the genitalia of small children. But is that a reasonable starting assumption?
It is, because I grant moral status to the newest infant on the planet. I'm saying that like just because they are an infant doesn't mean that I treat them with less dignity than an adult, merely on the fact that an adult has more agency.
Yeah.
So, and in fact, in some ways, since they're in a vulnerable state, you might even think of saying, I need to be even more serious about applying my standards for how much dignity and care I should take in terms of how I interact with them.
Yeah, good. Okay, good. So right. So once we have this assumption, then there are a couple different questions at play, right? One question is there a difference in how permissible it is to do something like hatafat brit for folks at different ages, assuming that they can't give consent? And then given that assumption, the answer is, well, it's going to be problematic at any age, but maybe we'll want to think that there's some kind of partial consent that can be at play. So age differences might still matter for this kind of fundamental permissibility question. But then there's also a question, Max, which I think you were just beginning to raise, and I definitely want to hear more of your thoughts on, about, sort of possible risks of psychological harm for folks who are old enough to remember a procedure like hatafat brit that they couldn't consent to.
I don't think that it's necessarily related to age. Like we only start bringing in age because it's attached to the observable criteria that people mature with age into beings with greater agency. So and I've put some work on this before, and I have more coming out about saying like, okay, we have this norm of the age of legal majority, which like you'll hear like a lot of like intactivists say like, oh, you could get circumcised when you're 18 or something like that. People tend to pin something to saying, then you're an adult, but nothing magical happens when you turn 18. So let's just put that out there. Like what's the difference between when you're 17 and when your birthday is the next day versus, you're pretty much the same person. We're just like trying to attach something that generally gets us to where someone has agency. So the problem isn't like age as a number. It's more the power asymmetry of someone who's reached that level of agency doing something to you when you aren't on equal footing to them. You're more vulnerable by virtue of like having a lesser capacity.
I want to push back for a second on that, just because I do think that age can play a morally relevant role insofar as if a person is old enough to object, that could make it morally worse to insist on a hatafat brit than if the person isn't even old enough to object.
I actually agree with you, and I'm happy you're raising that, because I don't think that contradicts what I said. It's just an important addendum. that like as you gain agency, that doesn't mean that power asymmetries become any less important.
No, but it could for sure make it worse. But I agree. Yeah.
And that's, I have more work coming out on this actually in the future, but that's an important feature of what I define and what I think is crucial to define as the category of genital cutting and what counts in that category. A main feature of the procedures we see, particularly from the religious groups, is that they're not consensual, even if you're objecting. And that's why we see for groups that have older children, deception is often a hallmark of the stories we see. Like particularly if we studied, in the paper, if we looked at the Dawudi Bora community, the testimonies of women who object to these procedures, like they're often not told what's going to happen. They don't really get a chance to know. And we see this with some cases of hatafat brit and not with others. There's a little more of a range that I studied. I certainly produced evidence in the paper that there are times when the child's not being prepped and not being told. And there are other times when the child objects, but their objection's overridden.
One thing that can come into consent, and this is captured to some extent by the paradigm of informed consent, basically is having a full sense of what to expect, the possible consequences, so that one can really be as in the know as possible, can have the full range of information when possibly offering consent. And there are various kinds we might think of informed consent that are age appropriate for different kinds of ages. So that's maybe one point to raise.
Yeah, and I also like on that, Max, I like the verbiage of assent versus consent in these, because we also wouldn't necessarily say that consent is always valid. When you raise the idea of informed consent, you're trying to get towards a higher standard of consent. Consent is not only just one binary thing. It has a range of like how valid we would see it in a lot of these situations. So like if say like you have a 5-year-old who's saying, no, I want this, it's reasonable to ascertain like how valid that consent is. So someone would call that assent. So I don't want to just raise the idea that consent in any way ameliorates all concern. So let me just put that out there.
Well, totally right. And really trying to have conversations with folks and be honest and sort of engage at an honest level about issues like hatafat brit with children, I think relates to these points about agency and autonomy and also respect that we were raising earlier, right? It seems to me that part of what it is to show sufficient respect for someone vis-a-vis these kinds of intimate body parts is to be very attuned to their response to, possible contact with those body parts, to be as honest as possible about, anything that one might want to do in contact with those body parts, which is not, sort of urgent or absolutely needs to be done to prevent them from some great harm. And so I think like all these sorts of values that we're kind of thinking about here with what might be problematic with hatafat brit, a lot of these are kind of fuzzy, but they all kind of fit together, and they also apply, I think, just as much in cases with children, although there might be various kinds of ways of navigating these situations that allow for age-appropriate input from children. But one thing that we would want to raise as well is that going over children's wishes is not appropriate at any age.
I think that the minimum bar has to be equipping the individual with as much chance to come to this in a dignified way as possible. So like if we're going to set it at any age, we don't want to be deceiving them into it. And so I'm saying like if you're not even getting their assent, then you're doing very poorly. If you're not even giving them a chance to object. And then if you're saying you're going to give them a chance to object, but then you're going to override their objection, then that's another level. But I think, in line with what Max is saying, like if we're assuming that the procedure is going to go forward, then trying to get some type of consent, even from an 8-year-old, like would be preferable. But I don't necessarily think that like that's what's most preferable in general. Like I think that it's possible to say that someone, while they're developing their capacity, needs, shouldn't even be asked about this type of thing. Like,
yeah, I'm super uncomfortable with this whole line of thinking that it's possible to get assent or consent from a child about something like this, that it's that if we're going to assume that the thing is going to happen, that it's desire. In some ways, I feel like it's more grotesque, right? Like in some ways, I feel like this is a thing. If this is a thing that's going to happen to the child, then like gaslighting them into some kind of, sort of stolen consent or assent to me is more morally grotesque than just doing it.
Yeah, that would be really bad. I definitely would be deeply uncomfortable with that.
I'm only even raising it because we're talking about like relative levels of, because I totally agree with you, Ellie. Like, but it's, if we just have to play this game of like what's worse, then I'm saying at least including them in the conversation is not as bad as just like totally physically forcing them or like.
There might well be, I mean, I think there definitely are, for various kinds of procedures and acts, ages at which it seems like someone can't give consent no matter what, right? So I think that's just going to be true. Hatafat brit for a 5-year-old, I think this is definitely going to be the case for. I think that much is quite clear. When we have something like hatafat brit, though, that doesn't cause a body modification, but can, under some circumstances, definitely cause psychological harms if someone later comes to view it as a violation, and for which, as we were talking about before, it would be kind of wrong to do without consent, even if there aren't any harms we can point to in the future. When we have something like this, it seems to me that as the age starts going up, if you are having a real honest conversation with a child that is respecting their agency, and given the circumstances, it's something that they really want for themselves, then, I'm not going to put a specific age on this, but it definitely seems like it would be reasonable under some circumstances to perform it. But it always has to be the case that you're not looking for an outcome when you're having that kind of conversation with a kid, right?
Yeah, I think this is really interesting because I think we're arriving at the conclusion that I think we all agree that there are lines here that shouldn't be violated. And I think that Max Buckler has made a very compelling case that hatafat brit violates a line that we don't want to violate because the potential harm and the actual disrespect to the individual outweighs any potential benefits. But what we're also I think the conclusion when you add consent into the mix that we're arriving at is that line then moves whenever the person can make up their own mind about this, which I think is right.
Yeah, no, totally. That sounds right to me as well. I mean, and one thing I think that's coming through as well is that when we think about a case like hatafat brit and then generalize it to genital cutting, different people are going to describe what exactly they think is wrong with it, if they think something's wrong with it, in different ways. Right. And it might well be that there's a sort of shared intuition that in cases of sexual boundary violation, there is something wrong, even if people can't quite agree about how to describe what's wrong. And I think Max is right in pointing to this kind of shared intuition, Ellie, which I think you were pointing out earlier as well.
Well, gentlemen, this has been a wonderful conversation. The Maxes are back.
No, this was great. I'm really so glad to be able to discuss these issues with you two. And Max, thank you so much for your work on hatafat brit and beyond.
Yeah, I think this is, I want to highlight that I think that we're really still at the beginning of my paper is not the end final word on these topics. It's kind of the first word about thinking through this as a boundary violation. Not to say that that argument has never been made before, but I'm just saying like that I see it as more of a conversation opener than a conversation ender. So I look forward to seeing where the conversation goes from here.
Thank you so much for your work. I found it particularly refreshing to think about genital cutting practices through the lens of hatafat brit, and that's a gift that you gave us, and I really appreciate it.
Totally agreed. And Max, what I really appreciate about your work, and I think this is true of Brian Earp's work as well, is trying to move beyond some of the battle lines in the bioethics literature on genital cutting, some of the specific debates that people have been having, which maybe aren't actually the most helpful for characterizing these cases. And so I'm so excited for all the great work that's going to come in the genital cutting bioethics literature.
Next time on the Bruchim podcast.
Let's put it this way. If I could find any sort of halachic justification that would be widely accepted to have just a hatafat dam and not an entire circumcision, I'd be the first to jump at it.
But implying that you think there is none.
Not that I found.
Yeah. It's not, and I'm not saying there necessarily is one. You know, it's
I'm not
something
necessarily
I
there is.
definitely
I'm
think
not
about.
necessarily saying that it's not going to change. Also, I think that maybe this is something that at least the non-Orthodox movements will have to consider at some point. You know, I'm not a physician. I know that the science behind us, the health benefits of circumcision are highly disputed, that you can find one study that says one thing, another that says another. I am not sure that I would give up circumcision. I don't think that many people as I think would give it up. But if there was this kind of an option, especially for conversion candidates and adults, I think that it would make things much, much, much easier.
Thank you for listening to the Bruchim podcast. If you like what you've heard here, please help us to sign up more Jewish communities and people to our Mark D. Rees Inclusion Directory. To apply, simply head on over to our website, bruchim.online, and under the What We Do tab, click on the Inclusion Directory, and then click on Sign Up Now.